Hello there, it's Shamrocker again. Welcome to the Proud Heretic channel. Today I want to talk to you about the rapture that stole my future and how I found heaven on earth. Let me ask you a question. What if one of the greatest obstacles to your spiritual healing wasn't doubt, but a story that you were told about the future? I spent decades waiting for the end of the world. And I'm sure that a lot of you know what I'm talking about. Every war, every earthquake, every election, every microchip, every headline, every strange sound in the night, every rumor about the Middle East, Israel, or Jerusalem, every prophecy conference, every bestseller about the Antichrist, every one of them whispered the same question into the back of my mind. Is this finally it? Could this be the day? Are you rapture ready? You see, looking back, I wasn't simply living with that blessed hope, as they used to call it. No, rather, I was living on high alert with a dysregulated nervous system. So I have found out through therapy. It's called hypervigilance. Always scanning the horizon in the clouds for Jesus. Always wondering if today's news was tomorrow's prophecy. And when your nervous system learns to always expect catastrophe and calamity, it's hard to be fully present for ordinary mundane life. But what if everything that I was taught about the rapture theory wasn't the timeless biblical certainty I assumed it was? What if the version of the rapture that many of us inherited wasn't part of mainstream Christian teaching for most of church history? And what if asking that question isn't about destroying faith, but rather about recovering it? Because here's what surprised me. The deeper I dug into the biblical scholarship, the biblical critical scholarship that I was never allowed to engage as fundamentalist evangelical, because it threatened the established dogma. But the more I dug, the more I discovered that the modern doctrine of the secret rapture of the church as a distinct event before Christ's visible return became influential during the 19th century through the teachings of John Nelson Darby, before spreading widely through prophecy conferences and then the Scofield Reference Bible. And eventually, it disseminated throughout popular culture. In the book, The Roots of Fundamentalism, Sandine documents how Darby's dispensationalism, the Plymouth Brethren, prophecy conferences, especially the Niagara Bible conferences, and the Scofield Reference Bible combined to spread pre-tribulation theology throughout American evangelicalism. Now, while historians continue to debate whether isolated earlier writers anticipated aspects of this pre-trib view, most agree that Darby systematized and popularized it in its modern form. So for much of church history, the dominant hope centered not on escaping the earth and being sucked up to heaven, but rather on Christ's return and God's ultimate renewal of a new creation. That historical discovery didn't answer every question I had, but it opened one that changed my life. And it's this: what kind of faith are we cultivating if we're always waiting to leave and escape instead of learning how to love the world that we're already in? For me, rapture anxiety didn't just shape my theology, it affected and shaped my psychology. It kept me suspicious, conspiratorial, us versus them, saved versus lost, God versus Satan, so on and so forth, waiting for the next prophetic clue instead of embracing the present moment. Recovery didn't begin the day I rejected a particular end times framework. Recovery began the day I stopped asking, how do I escape this world? And started asking, how can I be fully present within it? One unexpected guide on that journey came from the Celtic Christian tradition. Instead of teaching me to fear the earth, it invited me to pay attention to it. Instead of treating creation as some temporary waiting room, It taught me to see rivers, forests, changing seasons, and ordinary moments as places where God's presence could still be encountered. That shift didn't erase every fear overnight, but it began to quiet a nervous system, mind you, a dysregulated nervous system that has spent decades bracing for the end. So this episode isn't simply about debunking the rapture. It's about something much bigger. It's about moving from escapism to presence, from fear to healing, from waiting for the world to end to learning how to love the one we're currently living in and appreciating it and caring for the earth and being a good steward of our planet. It's the only one we've got. Part 1, the weight of waiting. So what happens when you're taught that the world could end at any moment? Not in some distant future, but today, before dinner, while you're on the toilet, before graduation, before retirement, before tomorrow morning. For me, that question wasn't theoretical. It became the very atmosphere that I breathed. I don't remember a season of my childhood or early adulthood when I wasn't constantly watching for signs. Wars in the Middle East, earthquakes, barcodes, Y2K, RFID chips, blood moons, political elections, economic collapse, even airplanes flying unusually low or seeing black helicopters in the sky. Ooh, boy, what's that all about? Every headline became another clue. Every conspiracy became another possibility. Every sermon seemed to end with the same message. Be rapture ready. Now, looking back, I wasn't simply living with hope. I was living with anticipation. And eventually, that anticipation became anxiety. It wasn't until years later, sitting in a therapist's office, beginning last year, that I finally had language for what I had experienced. But I never suspected that the call was actually coming from inside the house. That is, it was my very religious upbringing and my religion that had been at the root of many of my psychological disorders. Psychologists use the word hypervigilance to describe a persistent state of scanning for danger, a nervous system that struggles to relax because it's learned to expect catastrophe. Now, to be clear, hypervigilance has many possible causes. Trauma researchers most often associate it with experiences like abuse, violence, chronic instability, or other prolonged threats. So I'm not suggesting here that everyone raised with end times teaching develops hypervigilance, or that rapture beliefs alone explain it. I'm simply sharing with you what my experience was under that kind of teaching. I also know that I'm not alone in that because I speak with people literally every week who have gone through similar experiences under similar teaching. But in my own life, this constant expectation of imminent catastrophe reinforced that pattern. After all, we were constantly taught that the rapture of Christ is imminent. It's the doctrine of imminency, remember? It could happen at any moment. Dr. Laura Anderson, in her book, When Religion Hurts You, describes how some high-control religious environments can normalize chronic fear, shame, and threat awareness, leaving the nervous system continually braced for danger. She argues that the issue isn't simply theology or religion itself, but rather environments in which fear becomes a primary motivator for faith. When I read that, something clicked, because that's exactly how my body remembered those years, and I just never knew how to put a name to the face. Let's talk about fear as a spiritual habit. The strange thing about living in constant expectation of the end is that eventually you stop living in the present. I wasn't thinking about what kind of grandfather I wanted to become. I wasn't imagining forests 100 years from now, I wasn't asking, how can I leave the world better than I found it? Part of me honestly believed that history probably wouldn't last that long anyway. I don't think anyone intentionally taught me to neglect the future. Most of the people who taught me sincerely loved Jesus. Many were kind. Many genuinely believed they were giving me hope. But ideas have consequences. I mean, after all, if I'm constantly raised under the teaching that we're on the Titanic, so why polish the brass on a sinking ship? Because we're going to be out of here soon. It's not a stretch to believe that some people might come to experience that as very psychologically traumatizing to them due to the years of hypervigilance. Unintended consequence of constantly expecting evacuation is that investment can quietly lose its urgency. Does that not stand to reason? I mean, why plant trees if you're thinking you're going to be out of here by next Tuesday? Why spend decades restoring something if you're convinced it's about to disappear? Escapism and stewardship. Over time, I began asking myself a question I'd never seriously considered before. What kind of faith does my theology produce? Does it make me more present or less? More engaged or more detached? Now, I know many Christians who believe in the rapture and are deeply committed to environmental stewardship, social justice, and caring for future generations. So I'm not suggesting a one-to-one relationship between an end times view and how someone lives. However, I also know my own story, and nobody can gaslight me anymore or tell me that I don't know my own experience or that I shouldn't obey my own conscience in light of new and better information. You see, I choose data over dogma because I choose to live in an existentially shared reality with humanity. And I also know, again, the story of others. For some of us, the expectation of escape quietly became permission to disengage. After all, we're called to come out from among them and be ye separate from the world, saith the Lord. Well, the earth became a waiting room. History became a countdown. Creation became disposable because it's all going to burn up soon anyway. Climate change. That perspective became increasingly difficult for me to maintain as I paid closer attention to the world around me outside of the Truman Show. Regardless of where someone falls on specific policy questions, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that the Earth's climate is changing in ways that pose serious risks to ecosystems, economies, and human communities, with extensive evidence documented by organizations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and major national academies of science. Now, I don't believe that all of those organizations or institutions are in league with Satan in some grand conspiracy against Christianity and the Bible. They're questions about our neighbors, our children, our grandchildren, our shared home called this planet Earth. And suddenly I found myself asking a question I never imagined asking inside the framework of my old theology. But it was this: if God loves this world, why have I spent so much energy waiting to leave it? Personal turning point. That question didn't destroy my faith, it transformed it. Because I realized something. The opposite of fear is not certainty. The opposite of fear, in this case, is presence. Presence with my family. Presence with my neighbors. Presence with the earth beneath my feet. Presence with God right here and right now. And once I stopped obsessing over escaping God's good creation, I became free to fall in love with it, perhaps for the first time. That was the beginning, or a part of the beginning, of my recovery. Not because every theological question had been answered, because that's never going to happen, but because I was finally learning to inhabit the present moment instead of constantly rehearsing the end. Which raises an even bigger question. If the world isn't merely a temporary waiting room, then what is it? What if creation is not a sinking ship, but sacred ground? Because one of the most surprising discoveries in my own journey didn't come from prophecy charts. It came from an ancient stream of Christianity that taught me something I'd almost forgotten. Sometimes the holiest thing we can do is simply learn to love the world God already called good. Part 2. Reclaiming the sacred earth. When I finally stopped asking, how do I escape this world? Another question quietly emerged. What if I've been underestimating it? What if creation isn't simply the stage where the drama of salvation plays out? What if creation is part of salvation itself, a different kind of imagination? For most of my life, I unconsciously divided realities into two categories. There was the spiritual, and then there was everything else, the physical. Actually, I was very Gnostic or dualistic in my views of the creation under evangelical Christianity. Usually, spirit was good and flesh is bad. And so whenever you learn that pretty much anything flesh is bad, then you learn to carry guilt and shame for anything that you might feel. Because after all, you're also taught, according to Jeremiah 17:9, that you can't even trust your own heart. So what do you know? You see, heaven was spiritual, earth was temporary, or worldly. Souls mattered. Bodies eventually disappeared. Nature was beautiful, but ultimately disposable. Because remember, according to 2 Peter 2, it's going to all burn up in a fiery conflagration anyway. After all, if God's plan was to take us somewhere else, why become too attached to here? I don't think anyone ever said those exact words, but that was the imagination that I inherited. And again, I know I'm not alone. And then, quite unexpectedly, I stumbled into the Celtic Christian tradition. Discovering Celtic Christianity. I wasn't looking for a new religion. I wasn't trying to become mystical. Honestly, I was just exhausted. I was damn tired, okay? Exhausted from fear. Exhausted from always wondering what catastrophe might come next. Exhausted from believing God was primarily preparing me to evacuate. Then I encountered writers like John Philip Newell. His book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, didn't ask me to worship nature. It invited me to notice it. Here's the book here, and I would highly recommend this book to anyone who might be interested in reading about other strands of Christianity. And the Celtic Christian strand has been highly profitable for me personally, in my therapy and recovery. Newell's book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, didn't ask me to worship nature, but simply to notice it, maybe with fresh eyes, maybe for the first time. Now, that may sound like a small distinction, but it wasn't. Newell draws on the Celtic Christian tradition to recover a vision of creation not as something opposed to God, or as dirty, or disposable, but a place where God's presence is encountered. Rather than beginning with humanity's brokenness, he emphasizes the inherent goodness of creation, including humanity, and the sacredness woven throughout ordinary life. For someone raised expecting destruction, that felt almost revolutionary for me. Thin places. The Celts had a beautiful phrase. They spoke about thin places. Places where the distance between heaven and earth seemed almost transparent. A quiet shoreline, a forest at sunrise, the rhythm of waves, wind moving through old trees. They weren't escaping creation. They were encountering their ideas of God within it. For the first time, I stopped seeing nature as scenery before evacuation. I started seeing it as a sanctuary. Not because the trees were somehow necessarily divine, but because creation itself became a reminder that God's presence wasn't waiting for me somewhere else. It was already here the whole time. The Carmina Gadelica, one of the oldest treasures of Celtic spirituality I found, is a collection called the Carmina Gadelica. These are prayers gathered from ordinary people in Scotland and the Hebrides. Not scholars, not kings, not famous theologians, but farmers, mothers, fishermen, shepherds. The prayers bless ordinary and the most mundane things: lighting the morning fire, milking cows, planting seeds, crossing rivers, greeting the dawn, ending the day. And all of that struck me deeply. I found this very beautiful. These weren't people counting down to destruction. They were learning to see everyday, ordinary life, every act, as holy. Imagine that. A spirituality that finds God while baking bread, instead of only waiting for the last trumpet, healing the nervous system. Looking back, I didn't think my greatest need was better prophecy charts. I needed my nervous system to relearn safety. Therapists often talk about grounding, learning to reconnect with the present moment. Things like breathing, walking, feeling the earth beneath our feet, paying attention to a bird song, sunlight, the smell of rain, the rhythm of your own breathing. At first, I thought those were merely psychological exercises, and I was on board. But later I found they're deeply spiritual exercises too. Maybe the invitation has always been, be still and know, not panic and speculate. The more I practiced presence, the quieter my fear became. Not overnight, and I'm still a work in progress to this day. And I understand through therapy that I always will be. But true healing rarely works overnight anyway. But slowly, patiently, the world stopped feeling like a countdown clock. It was beginning to feel like home. From signs to stewardship. Something else surprised me. Once I stopped obsessing over signs, I started noticing seasons. Instead of asking, could this earthquake fulfill prophecy? I found myself asking, how can we help people after the earthquake? Instead of wondering, is this another sign of the end? I wondered, what would love of neighbor require of us right now? That's a profoundly different way of inhabiting the same world. One worldview turns every crisis into evidence that history is ending. The other turns every crisis into an invitation to compassion, to loving your neighbor, to empathy. One waits, the other participates. Creation is not disposable. Perhaps that's why the opening chapters of Genesis keep returning to the same refrain. And God saw that it was good. Not disposable, but good. Not temporary, but good. Not something to abandon, but good. I no longer want to be rapture ready. I want to be resilience ready. Because the world has always known suffering. It's always known wars, plagues, famines, political upheaval, economic collapse, natural disasters, so on and so forth. Every generation has faced reasons to despair. What changes history isn't predicting catastrophe. It's learning how to respond to it. Theologian Catherine Keller, in Facing Apocalypse, invites readers to think about apocalypse not merely as destruction, but as unveiling. Moments that reveal both our fragility and our responsibility. Rather than responding with paralysis or escapism, she encourages communities to cultivate resilience, imagination, and solidarity in the face of crisis. That attitude resonates deeply with my held liberal values. Because resilience doesn't deny suffering. It refuses to surrender to it. My recovery. The most unexpected miracle wasn't the change in my theology necessarily. It was noticing what happened inside my own body. The constant vigilance slowly softened. I found myself sleeping better, laughing more, making long-term plans, having better clarity of thought, planting things, doing puzzles, walking without scanning the sky for Jesus, enjoying sexual pleasure without shame, watching sunsets. Instead of watching prophecy updates, I still care deeply about the future. Not because I'm afraid of it, but because I want to help shape it. I want to be a participant in it. That's a very different way to live. Presence as spiritual practice. Today, one of the holiest things I do isn't studying prophecy charts. It's taking long walks beneath old trees, listening to birds I never noticed before, watching the seasons change, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, texting my children, checking on a friend, helping a neighbor. Those ordinary moments have become very sacred to me, not because they're spectacular, but precisely because they're not. They're real. And for someone who spent decades mentally living in tomorrow, learning to inhabit today has become one of the deepest forms of therapeutic healing I've ever experienced. Hope is participation. I've come to believe something I never expected to say. Hope isn't passive. Hope participates. Hope plants gardens. Hope adopts children. Hope builds schools. Hope protects rivers. Hope comforts the grieving. Hope speaks for the marginalized. Yes, even our LGBTQ plus neighbors and siblings. Hope creates art. Hope tells the truth. Hope refuses to surrender the world to despair. That's the kind of hope that I want to practice. Not because I'm certain exactly how history is going to unfold, but because love doesn't wait for perfect certainty before it starts serving. And that leads to another question. If my hope isn't primarily about escaping history, then what are we supposed to do with history? What does faithfulness look like? When we stop standing on the rooftop waiting for rescue and step back into the streets with shoe leather theology, where our neighbors actually live with boots on the ground. Because the prophets of Israel and Jesus himself, if we're going to follow his example and claim to be Christians, had something remarkably consistent to say about that. Are you willing to hear it and listen? They kept pointing people back to justice. Yes, social justice. Back to mercy. Back to the ordinary, mundane work of healing the world right in front of us. Part 4. Investing in earthly healing. So if hope isn't about escaping the world, what exactly are we supposed to do? I think that's the question I had been avoiding for years. Because once you stop waiting for evacuation, you have to decide how you're going to live. And when I returned to the Bible with fresh eyes, I was surprised by what I found. Not endless speculation about prophecy, but repeated calls to justice, to mercy, to compassion, to faithfulness, to build communities where people can flourish, where all of our neighbors can flourish. The prophets had different priorities. The Hebrew prophets were remarkably consistent, not in their accuracy rate of prophecy. We're talking about Amos, Micah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Again and again, they challenged societies that neglected the poor, exploited the vulnerable, and practiced corruption, and treated worship as a substitute for justice, or dogma over data. Again, you don't have to believe the Bible or be a Christian, but if we're going to be Christians or claim that we believe the Bible, then I'm simply using this as an opportunity to help educate you on how we can read the Bible as Christians in a different way than maybe we had inherited. So let's listen to Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? Or Amos 5:24. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. These two prophetic texts, I think, pair beautifully in our current discussion about ethical priorities in Scripture, emphasizing justice, mercy, humility, and righteousness rather than mere religious ritual or correct belief system. I mean, if we're building an argument that biblical faith prioritizes compassionate action alongside faithful devotion, then I think these verses fit well alongside Jesus' citation in Hosea 6:6, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Again, just read the red letters. And his teaching about the weightier matters of the law, faith, justice, mercy, and so forth, where he condemned the hypocrites in Matthew 23:23. Remember, he was condemning the religious hypocrites there. Might be something to think about, if the shoe fits, But notice something. The prophets and Jesus were not obsessed with predicting the future. They weren't. They were obsessed with transforming the present. That realization stopped me in my tracks because for years, I spent far more time trying to decode prophecy than asking whether I was becoming a more just, compassionate, loving, empathetic human being toward my neighbors. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly speaks about justice and righteousness expressed through right relationships and care for others. Those words aren't abstract theological ideas. They are profoundly practical. They ask questions like, how are the poor treated? How are immigrants welcomed? How are workers paid? How are widows protected? How are children cared for? How are people with less power treated? That's what biblical justice looks like. So again, if we're going to claim Christianity or our belief in the Bible, then let's start believing the Bible in these weightier matters of the law and not simply be obsessed over believing the right things or getting everybody to agree with you and your limited worldview, but rather embodying the right kind of love, which is unconditional toward all of our neighbors. My blind spots. One of the hardest realizations of my deconstruction was recognizing how selective my moral outrage had become. There were passages of scripture I could quote from memory, arguments I could win, people I was convinced were living in sin. And yet, there were entire books of the Bible calling God's people to confront greed, economic exploitation, dishonest scales, oppression of the marginalized, neglect of the poor, and I barely noticed them. That realization humbled me and troubled me because I wasn't just interpreting Scripture. Scripture was interpreting me. LGBTQ plus reflection. One example that still challenges me involves LGBTQ plus people. For years, I believed that confronting someone's sexual orientation or identity was one of the most urgent expressions of faithfulness. Now, looking back, I rarely asked a different question. What has this person's life actually been like? What burdens have they carried? How have they experienced God? What kind of fruit is their life producing? Instead, I often began with categories before I began with people. That doesn't mean Christians must all reach the same theological conclusions about sexuality, and I'm not here to argue that here. But it does make me ask whether my priorities reflected the priorities I see now repeated throughout Scripture. Jesus consistently moved toward people before making them evangelistic projects. He listened, he touched, he ate meals, he restored dignity. He called people to transformed lives, but he rarely began where I often began, and where many evangelical Christians begin, with labels rather than relationships. And when I look honestly at myself, I have to admit that certainty sometimes made me less curious, less compassionate, less empathetic, less willing to listen, less willing to learn. Jeremiah's unexpected advice. One passage that completely surprised me was Jeremiah 29. Israel is living in exile, and surely this would be the moment to wait for rescue. Instead, God tells them something unexpected. So again, if we're going to claim the Christian faith and say that we believe the biblical prophets, then let's believe the biblical prophets. God tells them something unexpected. Build houses, plant gardens, raise families, seek the welfare or the shalom of the city where you live. Not because exile is ideal, but because faithfulness begins exactly where you are. This vision of shalom calls God's people to become active participants in the flourishing of their communities rather than withdrawing into fear or resignation. That felt deeply relevant to my own journey, and still does. Because maybe spiritual maturity isn't measured by how eagerly we wait to leave. Maybe it's measured by how faithfully we cultivate peace while we're here. Liberation begins now. That same theme appears in liberation theology, which again was the enemy for me as an evangelical Christian. But Gustavo Gutierrez, in Theology of Liberation, challenged the idea that salvation is only about an individual soul reaching heaven someday. He argued that God's saving work also addresses the realities of poverty, injustice, oppression, and human dignity in the present. Whether one agrees with every aspect of his liberation theology or not, if we believe as Christians that God's kingdom has already begun, then what should it look like in our own neighborhoods, our schools, our workplace, our politics, our relationships? Because hope isn't merely something that we inherit. It's something that we practice. Eventually, all of this came together into one question I couldn't escape. Am I spending more energy predicting the future than improving the present? That question still convicts me, because it's easier to speculate, harder to forgive. It's easier to debate prophecy, harder to visit someone who's lonely. It's easier to argue online, harder to reconcile with family. It's easier to imagine God fixing everything someday. It's harder to become part of that healing this day. And that's where my understanding of hope has changed more than anywhere else. I used to imagine hope as leaving. Now I imagine hope as staying. Planting trees whose shade I may never sit beneath. Investing in children whose futures I'll never fully see. Loving neighbors who may never agree with me, because maybe that's what faith has always looked like. Not escaping history, but helping to redeem the small corner of it that we've been entrusted with as good stewards. Part 5, a new horizon of hope. Looking back, I don't think I lost hope. I think I found a different kind of hope. For years, hope meant leaving, looking for that blessed hope in the skies where every eye shall see him. Today, hope means staying, not because this world is perfect, far from it. There is and will always be war, injustice, grief, disease, cruelty, broken hearts. But hope no longer asks me to abandon the world because it's broken. Hope asks me to love it anyway. Looking back, sometimes people ask me, so do you regret your old faith? Honestly, not really. I wouldn't be where I am today without it. I didn't know any better. There were some beautiful people in those Christian churches. People who loved me. Teachers who sincerely believed that they were teaching me the truth and preparing me for the return of Christ. My parents gave me the very best they knew. And for that, I'll always be grateful. This isn't a story about villains. It's a story about personal growth. Because sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is allow yesterday's certainty to become today's curiosity. What recovery looked like. People often imagine healing as one dramatic moment. Mine wasn't. Mine happened quietly and is still happening quietly. It happened during long walks beneath old trees, watching sunlight filter through leaves, listening to birds I had ignored for decades, learning ancient Celtic prayers that blessed ordinary mornings, lighting candles instead of fueling panic, planting flowers instead of collecting prophecy charts, calling my children, saying, "I'm sorry that I was a bigot for all those years." Learning to breathe again. Learning that peace is not the absence of questions. It's the absence of constant fear. Planting trees. There's an old proverb often attributed to different traditions. It says, "Society grows great when old people plant trees whose shade they know they'll never sit under." Whether or not those exact words are ancient, the wisdom certainly is. Because planting a tree, what is that? It's an act of hope. You don't plant it for today. You plant it for someone you'll probably never meet. That's become one of my favorite images of faith. Not escaping, but planting. Not predicting, but cultivating. Not abandoning, but belonging. A different kind of readiness. People still ask me, "So, do you believe Jesus will return?" My answer is simple. I can't be certain. But I don't have to live life under that dogma. But I don't even need to be a Christian to hope for the flourishing of humanity and this planet, and to love my neighbor. I no longer spend my days trying to predict God's calendar. I'd rather spend them practicing Jesus' character. Because if Christ returned today, let's say, I don't think I'd want him to find me obsessing over headlines. I'd rather he find me planting something, say, a hydroponic garden, comforting someone, making peace, standing with the marginalized, laughing with friends, creating music, loving my family, trying, however imperfectly, to make this small corner of the world a little more beautiful than I found it. The new imagination. Today, I don't wake up wondering, could this be the day that everything ends? I wake up wondering, how can I participate in something that lasts? That shift changed everything. Because the future stopped being something to fear. It became something to help build. So, a final reflection. The irony is, letting go of rapture anxiety did not make me love God less. It made me love earth more. Not as an idol, not as paradise, but as God's sacred creation. The place where every act of mercy matters, where every tree planted matters, every apology matters, every child protected matters, every lonely neighbor matters, every injustice confronted matters, every meal shared matters, every small act of compassion, because these things become part of the larger story and our universal kinship. So the final call. If you have spent years waiting, watching, wondering if the next headline means it's finally time to get out of here and leave, may I gently offer another possibility for your consideration. Could I interest you in the prospect that maybe faith isn't primarily preparing for escape? Maybe faith is learning how to become fully present in the here and now, fully alive, fully compassionate, fully invested in the people and places God has already entrusted to us, if we believe in God. Because perhaps the question isn't how soon can we leave? Perhaps the better question has always been, how deeply can we love while we're here? For decades, I watched the sky. Today, I still look up, but not because I'm afraid, but rather, I look up in gratitude at the wonder of creation. And then I look back down at the soil beneath my feet, the people beside me. The trees are still growing, the work is still waiting. And I remember something I wish I had learned so much sooner. Hope isn't found in abandoning the earth. Hope is found in joining God in the quiet, courageous work of helping renew creation. So thank you for your time and attention to this episode of Deconstruction Diaries. If you feel this episode has resonated with you, feel free to like or subscribe below and leave a comment and tell me what part of faith did you have to unlearn to make you more loving. So, until next time, keep asking those tough questions and demanding rational answers. Keep choosing compassion over fear, love over bigotry, and keep planting trees. Peace.
But somewhere in the fine print, the bricks were hanging by a thread. So you love the blues, reliving the past, counting gold through just trauma held fast. Bricks on a thread.